Well, just take one state, say California. 1 in 5 Californians is out of work. Over 750,000 have lost their jobs, and desperately needed social services have already been savagely cut. According to the National Priorities Project, residents of California, taxpayers, have paid $38 billion already on the war in Afghanistan. That's 10,000 more, rather 10 billion more than the state's budget shortfall. Congressional candidates seem to have made a kind of truce not to talk about this stuff. The quid pro quos, war v. jobs, war v. human spending. Yet the ever-belching of jobs puts just about everything else on the block, with brutal effect for those held responsible. Office holders, for example, Democrats, you name it. What's it all mean for midterms coming up and the primaries in many places this week? Betsy Reed is the executive editor of The Nation magazine, as well as co-editor of Going Rouge and American Nightmare. We'll welcome her back to GRITtv in a minute.
We've now added private sector jobs every month this year, instead of losing them, as we did for the first 7 months of last year. We need to decide whether we're willing to do what's necessary to keep this economy moving in the right direction, whether we're willing to rise above the election time games and come together, all of us, Democrats and Republicans and independents, all of us coming together, not just to pass a jobs bill that is going to help small businesses like this one hire and grow, but also to secure a clean energy future and accelerate our recovery and rebuild our economy around 3 simple words: made in America.
So, Betsy, the big news of the week are the jobs numbers. That was the president talking about the jobs bill, for which Nancy Pelosi has summoned the House back from recess to vote this week. Will it make a difference?
Well, I mean, of course, it's $26 billion that people desperately need. It's going to prevent the layoffs of some 140,000 teachers, so that's a good thing. But the reality is that the states are facing a shortfall of $100 billion. And what we've seen, come out of the Senate and going through the House is just a drop in the bucket. I mean, it's barely a Band-Aid.
I was struck today reading the news that economists quoted in the New York Times were surprised by the savagery, basically, of the government public sector job layoffs this week. 131,000 jobs lost this month, I mean. They're surprised? Haven't they been watching the headlines?
I mean, it's devastating. And the other interesting thing you saw in the jobs numbers that just came out is that now it's more disproportionately women and minorities who are losing their jobs, because women and minorities are concentrated in the public sector. And that is what's been going on. I think people fail to sort of make a connection. There's all this Republican hysteria about deficits, but the reality is we're losing basic public services, and it's just going to worsen the economic pain.
Now, that comment about California was prompted in part by looking again at some of the good work that Rethink Afghanistan have been doing, drawing that connection between spending on war and spending on jobs. Is anybody making that connection in the campaigns this season?
It's by and large, it's not really happening politically. It's certainly not being led by the White House. I mean, what the White House is doing in some sense, I think, is politically smart, is stamping this the Bush recession, because that is what it is. I mean, this has come out of, it's been the result of the Bush years. But then the Republicans turn around and are trying to place the blame on Obama for mismanaging it. And, unfortunately, since the stimulus that Obama passed has not been large enough to meet the demand, that is having some resonance.
So what is your suggestion to candidates running this fall? I mean, Frank Rich talked about it being an easy way to win an election without really trying, to keep focusing on the Bush record. What should candidates do instead?
Well, I mean, I think people really need to understand the basic way in which we need government to survive and to come out of this crisis. I think there's a way in which ordinary Americans who are feeling deeply economically insecure look at deficits, and they think that somehow the deficits are responsible for their economic pain. And we're not on the liberal left side of the spectrum effectively making the argument we need to make about the way government needs to step in and spend money in order to pull the whole country out of this terrible morass.
So does that include kind of totting up all the victories of the Obama administration so far, or does that not really fly because people still feel in so much pain?
I do think actually it's important to look at the American Recovery Act and to give it credit for what it did achieve. It was a very significant historic piece of social legislation that probably did stave off a depression. And I think the Obama administration deserves some credit for achieving that. And instead, the sort of Tea Party is driving this debate and associating all of Obama's actions with this sort of bloated corporate state. And it's really obscuring what the real role of the government needs to be in the economy.
Let's talk about war. Time magazine's cover last week is still resonating for a lot of people. Pretty gruesome photograph of an Afghan woman who had lost both her nose and her ears to violence. It's a little unclear exactly the details of her story. I think you're working on something at The Nation.
Yes, we'll be coming out with a piece shortly by Ann Jones, who's done a lot of great reporting on the ground with women's organizations in Afghanistan. She's been following the situation there pre-war, during the Taliban, post-Taliban, and she really doesn't see a significant change for the vast majority of women in the Afghan countryside, the poor women of which Bibi Aisha on the Time cover is one.
And yet that's the argument. We can't possibly leave because what would happen to these women?
Yes, and Ann's point is, look, this is actually what happened with the U.S. presence. This happened last year. It was not under the Taliban. And it's actually kind of murky, the role that the Taliban played in this particular instance. And, it's the point is that we should not only be looking at a picture of this kind of violence in order to drive a debate that tries to ratchet up support for a war. We should actually be beginning with a discussion of Afghan women and what they need, which is not more war and military occupation, but an entirely new orientation, a new aid regime that puts their needs at the center.
Yeah. Now, Bradley Manning, the private who's accused or suspected of having leaked the documents that were posted by WikiLeaks last month, said to one of his confidants online at the time that if there wasn't a deep discussion about what's happening in Afghanistan prompted by the WikiLeaks release, then we were doomed. Those were his words. This is what we're getting from the Pentagon this weekend. Take a look. Pentagon spokesperson speaking on August 5th.
WikiLeaks' public disclosure last week of a large number of our documents has already threatened the safety of our troops, our allies, and Afghan citizens who are working with us to help bring about peace and stability in that part of the world. If doing the right thing is not good enough for them, then we will figure out what other alternatives we have to compel them to do the right thing. Let me leave it at that.
Leave it at that, but it's pretty clear he's not ratcheting down Pentagon anger about this leak. Sounds like ratcheting up and even imagining legal prosecution. What else are we to make of that?
What's really unfortunate is that this incredible disclosure of all of these atrocities and this revelation that the war effort is basically a complete disaster has turned into, in our media, a debate about the ethics of WikiLeaks and about this computer hacker who, there's a pretty poignant front page New York Times story about his life history and how he wound up in this place. And, to make him the criminal, the major demon in this, is just, it shows a completely off, kilter sort of moral compass right now in the country.
One last thought, which has to do with the implications for us as a society of how we have or haven't responded to the WikiLeaks thing. I mean, people in the independent media keep talking, but it doesn't seem to be resonating. It doesn't seem to be having an impact.
Well, I don't think the mainstream media has taken it up. I mean, the mainstream media is sort of tired of the war story, and that's old news. That those Afghans are getting killed. But what they're interested in is this personality drama, and they're taking the lead of the White House and just running with it. So I think it does show, you're right, the absolute essential need for the independent media to drive the story in the right direction.
Well, I know you'll keep doing it at The Nation. Thanks so much. Betsy Reed is one of the editors at The Nation magazine. There are links to her work and more at thenation.com.